people. Alright, hope this works. Yeah, sorry this video is coming out late. I think most of you know I tried making it and it got deleted. It was a real pain. So I'm trying some different video software. So thanks to Angelique for recommending it. I tested it, looks like it works. The downside is you can't see me. But I think you'll live, and I'll live too. You can see the slides at least, and that's what's important. So this is going to be a long one. We got to finish up chapter 13, and then all of chapter 14 as well. But you'll probably play this on times 10 speed anyways, so you will get through it. Alright, let's get going. Where we left off was on Kansas, Nebraska. So just a quick review. Remember, this was about building the railroad, right? Because we just recently got, the U.S. gets California, it becomes a state. Okay, trade with Asia, that's a real big deal. The problem is it's hard to get to California. You have to go all the way around South America or to Central America, cross on overland and then take another boat. So it's a pain. So the solution is, and technology's there at this point, let's just build a transcontinental railroad. In other words, a railroad from one side of the U.S. to the other. But like everything else in this time period, it becomes a north versus south debate. Because we can see on the map, the railroad could run and connect with other tracks in the north, and it could do the same thing going down south. And we got this guy, Stephen A. Douglas. He's a senator from the state of Illinois. He wants it to run through the north. He is a Democrat, Northern Democrat. It'll be good for his state, his region, and himself personally, because he owns land in Chicago. Value of that land will go up. But he knows he has to get the South on board. So he passes, or manages to get enough support in Congress. So he authors, I should say, and passes, with the support of others, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And essentially what this does is it repeals the Missouri Compromise and says all this land in the former Louisiana Territory, north of the 3630 parallel, well, that can now have slavery. And he organizes Nebraska and Kansas into two territories. And this is good for the argument of building the railroad through the north, because remember the southern argument for the railroad was, well, railroad could run, if we run the railroad through the south, it'll travel through states or organized territories the whole way. And remember, it's important that a territory be organized, because if it's unorganized, that means it has no federal authority there. In other words, no, troops, soldiers. And that's important, right, because it's a long stretch of track. It could be attacked by natives who are resisting American encroachment, or train robbers. So one way or the other, this railroad's going to be safe. It has to have protection. Well, now that these territories are organized, if the railroad runs through the north, it'll have the same protection if it were to run through the south. But again, to get the Southerners on board, well, we've now opened up both Nebraska and Kansas to slavery. Not necessarily, because what the law says is that slavery in these territories will be decided by popular sovereignty. And that's just a fancy way of saying the people will get to vote yes or no on slavery. But the thinking is that, all right, well, Kansas, which is next to slave Missouri, they'll probably vote to be a slave territory. And Nebraska, which is next to some free territories and states, well, they'll probably vote to be a free territory. Again, that's not in the law. That's just the unofficial understanding between the two sides. But of course, from the Southern perspective, whereas before slavery was definitely banned, now it's potentially open, and in their view, likely they'll get it in Kansas. Douglas himself, he really didn't care about the issue of slavery personally. He was self-interested here, wanting to make money for himself, his region, and his home state. But a lot of Northerners felt differently. So this pushes them towards the abolition movement and away from the Democratic Party in the North. And that's important because it leads to the rise of the Republican Party. So the Republican Party, it is a direct result, or the rise of the Republican Party, the creation of the Republican Party, is a direct result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what this party wants to do is it wants to end the expansion of slavery out west. And that should sound familiar because this is like the Free Soilers, who existed since 48, I believe, so just a little bit before the Republicans. So the Republicans aren't the first political party to come up with that idea, but they also have it. But they go a step further than the Free Soil Party and actually claim that slavery is immoral. And that's a really big deal, because that might sound obvious to us today. But at the time, no major political party had made that stance yet. The Whigs hadn't, the Democrats hadn't, even the Free Soilers, who are opposed to slavery's expansion in the West, even they hadn't said it's immoral. So the Republican Party is going that extra step, and that is important because words, do have power. Just calling out slavery for what it was, evil, it was important. It was an important step in the creation of this conflict that will lead to eventually the end of slavery. Despite this, though, even though they say it's evil, they do explicitly say, well, we won't try and end it where it already is, in other words, in the South. And they did that because they knew that if they called for an end of slavery in the South, that would lead to a steep rise in sectional tensions. They'd also be less likely to get votes from Northerners, even some Northerners who didn't like slavery as well, but were concerned about the breakup of the Union. So they don't go that far. But they do call for an end to the Fugitive Slave Act. Remember that extra detestable part of the Compromise of 1850. And of course, they call for an end to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I say of course because this party rises in direct opposition to that law. So again, of course, they call for an end to it. And the rise of the Republicans, it's really phenomenal because they quickly become the dominant party in the North. We'll discuss this more in a second, but we've seen that so far we've gone through two-party systems in the U.S. Right? The first one is Democratic Republicans versus Federalists, and the second one is the Democrats versus the Whigs. And that took time. Like the creation of the Whig Party was not something that happened overnight. But the creation of the Republican Party and its gaining popularity really was almost an overnight phenomenon. So it was made up of former Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats. So remember, in this time period, both parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, were national parties. In other words, they enjoyed support from both the North and the South. And that could change election to election, but in general, that was the case. So, of course, Southerners didn't support this party. But Northerners from both of the major political parties, again, Whigs and Democrats, do join in. The Republicans also do end up absorbing the Free Soilers because, of course, they're in total agreement on the being anti-expansion of slavery out west. They even take on some of the Know-Nothings, also known as the American Party. That was that anti-immigrant party we talked about a few chapters ago. Yeah, again, it's the first party to take a stance on slavery. It's also the first political party to be entirely sectional. In other words, they get zero support from the South. They get all of their support from the northern states. And some of you might be thinking back to the Federalists, and okay, well, weren't they a sectional party? And yeah, they largely were, but sometimes they did make some encroachments outside of the Northeast. And of course, that was the first two-political party system, first two-party political system. And the second one that is now ending, the Whigs versus the Democrats, both of those parties did remain national from 1828 to 1852, which is more or less the death of the Whig Party. The creation of this party also puts pressure on the Northern Democrats because it ends up creating a split between Northern versus Southern Democrats. And we'll see that once we get into the election of 1860. Ultimately, the Southern Democrats will end up being the dominant force in the Democratic Party. and that'll push the Democratic Party down south for actually several decades. That won't really flip until the 1930s. We're ways off from that, so we'll get there when we get there. Well, that's something to keep in mind for the time being. Some other things the Republican Party supported was the Homestead Act. That essentially just said federal government will give essentially like poor farmers land out west. I forgot the number of years, but you had to work on it and improve it for a number of years, and then the land would become yours. So that's to encourage Western settlement and help poor whites. It was also an idea of the Free Soil Party, but that attracts votes from, again, poorer whites up north. And they support other things that'll look familiar, like internal improvements. And in this time period that we're in, that really means railroads. Previously when we looked at Clay's American system, we were really talking more about roads and canals. But the technology's there now for trains, so they support that. They also support a protective tariff, and those last 2 points should sound familiar. Okay, wait, isn't that what the Whigs always wanted? And it is. But these policies are particularly popular in the North. And although the Republicans' main reason for existing, at least at first, is to be in opposition to slavery, they know they have to have a broader appeal if they're ever going to get substantial votes from Northerners. So they, in addition to being opposed to slavery and its expansion, they also tack on all these other things, homestead, internal improvements, protective tariff, that they know is going to be popular with the Northerners. And this does mark the rise of the third two-party system. So let's do a little bit of review. And for context, we're on 3.5 today. And we still do have the Republicans and the Democrats. They don't disappear. They are around in 2020. But they do a regional flip. The Republicans will move down south, and Democrats will move into the Northeast and West Coast, which is more what our map looks like today. So again, that happens from the 1930s to 70s, and we'll get there when we get there. Well, let's do a little bit of review for now, what the two-party system looks like in the U.S. or how it evolved. And remember, we start off with the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists were pro-federal power, Democratic Republicans were pro-states' rights. But the Federalists die after the War of 1812 and the Hartford Convention. And for a while, we have, technically one political party, just the Democratic Republicans. That's during the era of good feelings. But even during that time period, of course, there were divisions in that party with the National Democratic Republicans. And they had more Federalist ideas, were loose constructionists. And then there were the Jacksonian Democrats, who were the more states' rightists. And that'll evolve pretty directly into the Democrats versus the Whigs. So we can see the Whigs really taking up the mantle of the Federalist ideas. Again, things like Hamilton wanted in his financial plan, such as a Bank of the United States and creating an industrial economy. And the Democrats really holding the line for states' rights. That's the second two-party system. But with the creation of the Republicans, we're now in the third. And we can see, based on this image, it shows the Whigs evolving into Republicans. And I mean, that's a convenient way to look at it. It's not a perfect explanation because not all Whigs become Republicans. Southern Whigs don't, right? They would switch over to the Democratic Party because slavery was really important to them. And of course, some Northern Democrats become Republicans. So it's a very complicated thing. We're trying to explain it simply here. I want to point out those complications to you. But the reason we say, all right, the Whigs become the Republicans is because, just like we saw on the last slide, Republicans do take up a lot of those core Whig ideas, right? Internal improvements. Sorry, I'm blanking. Internal improvements, protective tariffs. Sorry, blanked on that. Again, just supporting industry in general. So that's why we're viewing it in this way. And then so the Democrats will go on up until the present. That is the party of Mr. Biden, and the Republicans will go up until this day too. That is our current president, Mr. Trump. He is a Republican. obviously, these parties will change a lot as time goes on because issues change. Things are very different in 2020 than they were in the 1850s. So we'll keep watching how these parties change over time, but this is the end of the major political parties in the United States changing, which is good news for you because that should simplify things a little bit moving forward. All right, so that was some review. Let's get going back with our Civil War history, and let's get back into Kansas because things aren't going well over there. So we get this issue that, all right, well, Kansas was unofficially was supposed to definitely become a slave state. But it turns out more Northerners actually immigrate, or migrate, I should say, into Kansas than Southerners. And when it comes time to vote on a territorial legislator, looks like the people of Kansas are going to vote to be, or for opponents of slavery. They're going to vote against slavery. The South looks at this and says, hey, our deal has been broken. We gave up that transcontinental railroad in order to get some more slave territory. So the South feels cheated, although they technically were not. And they respond to this by actually cheating. When it comes time to vote in 1855 on that territorial legislator, we have a group known as the Border Ruffians. They come in from Missouri into Kansas and they vote illegally. And I say they vote illegally because this vote was only supposed to be open to the people of Kansas, not to people from the neighboring state. But they do it, they're successful, they are able to essentially rig the vote and vote in pro-slavery candidates into that territorial Kansas legislator. Again, so they win, and they establish the official government of Kansas at Suwanee Mission. You can see that on the zoomed-in map of eastern Kansas here. But the anti-slavery Kansanites, is that what you call them? I don't know, Kansonians? Kansanites sounds better. I'll go with that. Those anti-slavery Kansanites, they're real mad about this because, of course, they were cheated. So they end up forming their own, illegal anti-slavery government over here in Topeka, Kansas. And I say illegal because it went against the results of the election. But, of course, the election was rigged, so we're in an interesting scenario now. Who's the official government? The one that won the official rigged election, or the one that was set up in protest to that election? Well, at this point, technically, the anti-slavery government is illegal, since Congress didn't invalidate those results. Nevertheless, things are heating up. So what ends up happening in 1856 is a group from the pro-slavery camp goes to the town of Lawrence, and Lawrence is aligned with Topeka, so they're against slavery. So pro-slavery groups come into the town. They burned part of it down. From what I remember, there was no casualties, but it was obviously an aggressive act because they torched the town. And then that leads to this guy over here, John Brown, and his revenge. And just a side note here, John Brown is a fascinating historical character. I mean, just look at him. He's a scary-looking guy. He knew he was a scary-looking guy, too. There is, supposedly he said this, and I like to believe he did. He said that he could stare down a dog and make it slink out of a room backwards. Because he just had, he was a terrifying person. Well, John Brown, terrifying as he may be, was on the right side morally on the slavery issue. He was very much opposed to slavery, and he wanted it ended in the United States. But how he went about doing that is definitely controversial. So in response to the sacking of Lawrence, John Brown gets a group of men together, heads down to a place called Potawatomi Creek. It was a settlement, like a small town, with pro-slavery settlers. And he took out, he killed all the adult men in that small town. violently too. I mean, I guess any murder is violent, but like with swords and axes in front of their families. So it was a gruesome massacre. So yeah, I mean, they pro-slavery groups that come in and torch the town. He murders a bunch of all the men in these various families. So that's this essentially kicks off a mini civil war in Kansas, leads to more violence. So now anti-slavery and pro-slavery groups are shooting at each other, and it doesn't end. It just merges into the larger Civil War, 1861. So that just keeps going. So things are heating up. They're getting really bad. While this is going on, politics keeps going in America. So we have the election of 1856. And we'll go back to Kansas in just a moment because that story's not over. But essentially, this election is between the Democrats and the Republicans. There's kind of a last-ditch effort by the remnants of the Whig Party combined with the American Know Nothing Party, using former President Fillmore as a candidate. As you can see on the map, they're not too successful. It doesn't really matter too much to our story here. The big picture is this is Democrats versus Republicans. The Dems end up running a new candidate, Buchanan. They reject Pierce. Remember, Pierce won the election in 1852. So he was only a one-term president, but the Democrats ditch him because Buchanan was Kansasless. In other words, Kansas-Nebraska was super controversial. And the Democrats, still being a national party, still hoping to get votes from the North, which they ultimately do, didn't think it was a good idea to run a president who had supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So they end up, again, ditching him. They nominate Buchanan. The Republicans run a guy called John C. Fremont. He was a frontier army captain. The Dems end up running on popular sovereignty, so they're not pro-slavery, but they're saying, oh, we'll let the people decide in these western territories. And the Republicans end up running against the expansion of slavery, just like their party platform said. So they don't want it in the West. They don't even want the potentiality of it out West with popular sovereignty. So the Dems end up winning, as you can see on the map, but Republicans make a real strong showing, given that they're a 2-year-old party. They take the New England, New York, and a couple of other northern states. And it's worth noting, too, that one of the reasons that the Republicans lost is because they ran this guy, Fremont. He was not a particularly strong candidate. He had a terrible reputation, known for being dishonest. And the Republicans, knew this. They didn't, they weren't like, oh, shoot, we chose the wrong guy. Some of the big stars of the Republican Party, one of them, his name is Mr. Seward. He'll actually be Lincoln's Secretary of State. Let's say the top shelf, the star Republicans, had a feeling that 1856 wouldn't be their year, so they didn't want to run any of their top shelf candidates. Didn't want to have a loss associated with them, so they knowingly chose a second or third shelf candidate. So that it, again, wouldn't impact the future prospects of their the most elite members of the Republican Party. So that's one of the reasons they lost. There was also fear of secession. At Southern, they're called fire eaters. In other words, pro-secessionist Southerners. There was a fear that, well, if we put a Republican in the White House, the South will leave the Union. And of course, that ends up being true in the next election. So those fears were not unfounded. There's just not enough anger, though, in the North at this point to take that risk. That'll change by 1860. But again, really the main takeaway here is, yeah, the Republicans lose, but they do. It's a really strong showing for them. It's also important to note that the Dems are now the only national party left. Republicans are purely sectional. Whigs they're basically dead. They don't come back after this election. So for our purposes, they're dead. So that's it. We have one national party, one sectional party, and then some couple of other third parties that are not of any particular consequence at this point. That's important, although that will change with the next election as well. All right, but let's go back to Kansas because things are not done getting all screwed up over there. So last we looked at Kansas, yeah, they're fighting with each other. They have that pro-slavery territorial legislator. But by 1857, it's become time for Kansas to apply for statehood. They now have enough people that they can write up a state constitution, send it to Congress, and then become a state. But now, according to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it's up to the people of Kansas to vote on slavery. They can vote, yes, we'll have it here, or no, we will not. And despite the fact that the government, which won that election through cheating, is pro-slavery, there's nothing they can do about that directly, but they come up with a tricky solution. In order to subvert the will of the people, they make this document known as the Lecompton Constitution. And what it does is it says, all right, people of Kansas, you can all vote yes or no on slavery. And we have to do that. That's federal law. But we're not actually going to give you a chance to vote on the Constitution itself. And the Lecompton Constitution protected the rights of slave owners who were already living in Kansas. So, in other words, even if the people of Kansas come out and vote no on slavery, all right, that means no future slave owners can come in and bring their slaves. But the ones who are already there, well, they can keep it, even if the people of Kansas vote no. So again, this was clearly meant to subvert the will of the people. The pro-slavery legislator knew that most Kansanites didn't want slavery, so they didn't give them the choice to vote yes or no on the Constitution, just on the issue of slavery itself. But that Constitution protected slavery within Kansas. It's a tricky document. It's a little bit confusing, but the reason it's important is this. And again, no matter what, slavery will be part of Kansas, at least in some form. But again, the reason it becomes important is because it's going to end up leading to more divisions, specifically within the Democratic Party. President Buchanan ends up supporting the Lecompton Constitution. In other words, he gets behind it and he is sympathetic to the South. But Douglas, and that's him pictured to the right, he rejects it. And Douglas is he's a major star within the Democratic Party, and especially that northern element of the Democratic Party. So he uses his power in Congress as a star senator to force Kansas to resubmit the Constitution to the popular vote. In other words, he says, no, you have to let the people of Kansas vote on the entire Constitution, not just slavery itself, because you're undoing this is going against the spirit of popular sovereignty. But the reason this is important is because it creates divisions within the Democratic Party. We end up getting Northern Dems, really led by Douglas, versus Southern Dems. In the end, the Southern element of the Democratic Party will end up becoming the more powerful part. And eventually this is going to push the Dems down south entirely, although we're not quite there yet, and that will be important in the election of 1860. So the Democrats, because of the Lecompton Constitution, are now on their way to becoming a sectional party as well. Again, not entirely there yet, but we're getting there. So the next big thing that really angrifies, makes people upset, is this decision in Dred Scott. And we covered this in class, so we'll go over it quickly. But Dred Scott was a slave who sued his master for freedom. Essentially what happened was his master was an army doctor. He was sent up to Wisconsin, a free territory. When he was sent up there, he brought Mr. Scott with him. He lived up there for about 2 years with Scott before returning to Missouri. So on the basis of that, Scott sues his master and argues that he should be free because he lived in a free territory. That means he's a free man. And he sues. It takes many years. Finally, it makes its way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules against Mr. Scott. And the first thing they say is that, well, African Americans aren't citizens, so they can't sue in the first place. That was terrible for Mr. Scott. But if it had ended there, if that's all the Supreme Court had said, this wouldn't have been of such national importance. But the Supreme Court decided to go a step further, and they end up saying, well, according to the Constitution, in particular the Fifth Amendment, government can't take away private property without the due process of law. Like, in other words, you have to commit a crime in order for the government to be able to take your property away. So they say, well, on that basis, actually, the federal government can't take away any any owner's slaves, because slaves are private property. And following that logic, they said, well, if the federal government can't take away an individual's, slaves' property, that means the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional the whole time, because that was the federal government trying to take away people's slaves if they brought them up north. Now, the Missouri Compromise had already been repealed, right, by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but it doesn't matter, because what the court is saying, in effect, is that if in the future the federal government would like to try and ban slavery in any territories, it can't. So slavery is legal throughout the West now. It's legal everywhere. There's nothing the North can do about it. And that does not go over well. North gets real angry. In particular, they're looking at this and thinking, wait a second, we're bigger. So we should have more representation in the government, and our economy's bigger, and we have more land. We're bigger and better than the South in pretty much every way. Why does the South keep winning these victories? It creates essentially a conspiracy. Somehow the Southerners have more power than they should in the government. And there was some truth to that conspiracy. Because, of course, the court did rule in favor of the South in this case. And that's important because it pushes even more Northerners into the Republican Party. And that's going to be real important when we get to 1860. And we're getting to 1860, so let's look at it. This ends up being a pretty interesting election because it ends up being a four-way one. Republicans nominate Abraham Lincoln. He was not actually the Republican superstar of the day. Their superstar was Mr. Seward, who will end up becoming Secretary of State. But the Republicans as a whole end up going with Lincoln because he's more moderate. Seward is much more ferociously anti-slavery. And although the Republican Party is against slavery, they were hoping a more moderate Lincoln would reduce the threat of secession, which it doesn't. But that was the hope, so that's how Lincoln ends up getting nominated. They run again, free homesteads, internal improvements, protective tariffs. Again, this northern wish list to broaden their appeal, plus the very important curbing the expansion of slavery, which is, again, the whole reason that party existed in the first place. But the Dems end up splitting on this election, and they run two candidates. Douglas, we're seeing him again, runs as a Northern Democrat, and a guy called Breckinridge runs as a Southern Democrat. Well, Douglas champions popular sovereignty, let the people decide, right? And he's been pushing that for years, since Kansas, Nebraska, so he's just continuing to go along with that. But the Southern Democrat says, no, I call for an unrestricted expansion of slavery out west. And he goes, and you know what? Let's annex Cuba too, because why not? And remember, the Southerners had their eye on Cuba for a while. Remember that Ostend Manifesto under the Pierce administration? The U.S. had tried to buy Cuba to have more slave territory. Well, they haven't lost that desire for Cuba yet. Arguably never will, and we'll get to that when we get to the Spanish-American War. But so takeaway is Breckinridge is super pro-slavery. Douglas is somewhere in the middle with popular sovereignty. Republicans are fairly opposed, although again, let's be clear, they're not calling an end for slavery in the South, only out west. And then we get a fourth party that's actually pretty lame. They're called the Constitutional Union Party. They ran a guy named Bell. I say they're lame because their platform was like a nothing platform. They said, we run on enforcing the law, upholding the Constitution, and preserving the Union. Which, like, okay, they really cared about keeping the U.S. together, but they took no stance on the major issue of the day, which was slavery. So it was really a cop out. But they do get a lot of support, and this map is interesting when we look at it because, well, we can see the North votes very solidly Republican. The Deep South votes solidly for the Southern Democrat, the pro-slavery one. And then here in the middle, like geographically in the middle, we get the politically, middle of the road candidates winning there, right? So that constitutional union wins in the eastern border states, and Douglas wins in Missouri. And of course, it's not perfect because we can see Maryland and Delaware do vote for the Southern Democrat Breckinridge. But still, it is interesting, and it's worth noting that some of those border states will join the Union, and that's Kentucky and Missouri, and Virginia and Tennessee won't secede right away. So it does show us that views are complex. Yes, there is a strong pro-slavery element in the South and a strong anti-slavery sentiment in the North, but there is also a desire to keep the Union together among people on both sides. Constitutional Union, they're made up of former Whigs, moderate Democrats, some know-nothings. In other words, people who, Whigs who didn't find a new home in the Republican Party, and Democrats who didn't like the Southern Democrat or Douglas's popular sovereignty. The major takeaway is Lincoln wins, but entirely with sectional support, and this leads to secession. Deep South votes to secede from the Union in response to Lincoln's victory. We can see that here, right? That's sorry, I just had a fear. Okay, I'm good. My fear is averted. It just crossed my mind, like, wait, am I sure it's recording? I did not want to lose that again. That would have crushed my spirit. Okay, sorry, I'm concentrating again. Alright, this does lead, Lincoln's election does lead the Deep South to seceding from the Union. And it's interesting, these states in, Brown? Is that Brown? We'll call it Brown. These states in brown here are the first to secede, to leave the United States. You can see the dates on that. South Carolina is the first to go. But notice these other ones, January of 1861, Texas is February. Well, remember, presidents win elections on even years, but they don't take office until the next. So for instance, Biden won the election in November, but he doesn't take office until January 2021. And actually, back in this time period, new presidents didn't take office until March. That changes in the 20th century. Lincoln wins in 1860. But before he even takes office, all of these states leave the Union in response to his victory. But again, he's not in office yet. And it's interesting, too, because it's worth noting that the Deep South is where cotton really flourished. The Upper South, this is still tobacco country, especially in Virginia, which is not as profitable in this time period as cotton. So it is interesting that the states that are less economically tied to slavery take longer to secede, and we'll get to that in the next chapter. Any which way, it's worth pointing out that this is a massive overreaction by these states. Republicans didn't even take control of Congress, and Lincoln made it very clear that he would not have tried to end slavery in the South. But from the Southern perspective, they're thinking, well, even if this president and this Congress doesn't end slavery, writing's on the wall. Northerners don't like our way of doing things, and this is going to lead to a reckoning, so it might as well be sooner rather than later. At least that's the Southern perspective on this. These seceding states create the Confederate States of America. It's real similar to the U.S. Government and U.S. Constitution, but explicitly pro-slavery. Buchanan, who is on his way out, does nothing to stop secession. He really leaves it to the next guy. There's a last-ditch effort to save the Union. That was the Crittenden Compromise, named after a senator. I believe he was from Virginia. It doesn't really matter. But essentially, what the compromise tries to do is they say, oh, hey, remember that old Missouri Compromise line? Why don't we just draw that line across the entire map of the United States? We'll extend it all the way to the West Coast, and we'll say north of the line slavery is banned, and south of the line slavery is not banned. It's legal. Then can't we all just, get along and still be a United States? And of course, they would have made an exception for Missouri, Kentucky, and Virginia, and Maryland and Delaware, which were north of that line in slave states. But before coming into office, Lincoln signals that he would reject this compromise. Partially, he says, well, this is against the Republican platform. We ran on ending slavery, or ending its expansion out west. But secondly, Lincoln looks at this and says, all right, if everything south of that line can have slavery, we're going to have perpetual war with Central and South America. Because the Southerners are going to be like, well, let's take Cuba then. That's south of that line. And maybe we'll take some other places too. And remember, we had that strange private Walker expedition, which went into Nicaragua to try and expand slavery. Well, next time that could be an official U.S. invasion. All in the name of expanding slavery. So Lincoln looks at that and says, well, that would be bad. So let's not do that compromise. And this is interesting because Lincoln is super pro-union, and he'll make that clear throughout the Civil War. He really wants to hold it together, but he still doesn't go in for this compromise, which ultimately we know ends up being the right choice because his decision, although there will be a terrible price to pay for it, will lead to the end of slavery. So that's obviously a good thing. All right, I'm going to stop this video. I'll start the make a new one. I'm just like paranoid I'm going to lose this. It's affecting my focus. All right, what do? I just click that. Okay.